Good morning, everybody. My name is Pierre Jacquet. I am the president of the Global Development Network, a public international organization headquartered in New Delhi, in India. And the mission of GDN is to promote local research in developing countries in the social sciences in order to increase the local capacity to define the policy debate, to study the policy options, to recommend policy solutions on their own rather than being simply dependent on outside external advice. So it's a story about building local ownership on development policies. As part of this effort, we engaged into a discussion with the Gates Foundation a couple of years ago on the future of development assistance, and that led to an essay competition to bring up new ideas on development assistance. We got more than 1,000 essay submissions, and 13 of them were recognized and won the competition. And among these 13 essays, some of them, at least two of them, focused on institutional change in development agencies. Hence, the subject that we decided to cover in this meeting today on what should tomorrow's development agencies look like. I want to thank the Center for Global Development very warmly for hosting this meeting. As you know, CGD has been at the forefront of the debate on foreign development assistance in many, many ways, and we are very happy to have these opportunities to float again some of these ideas here with you this morning. To help us with this subject, let me mention why I think the subject is very important nowadays. There are many, many reasons, but three of them come to my mind. One, of course, is the Sustainable Development Goals. They create new challenges. Now that we have adopted the goals globally, comes the challenge of local implementation. How to bridge the global and the local, how to help developing countries find the local solutions and choose the priorities, because obviously no country will be able to pursue at the same time 17 objectives monitored by 169 indicators. That doesn't make a policy. So choosing priorities and implementing these priorities is going to be a very, very much political, economic, and social local exercise. And of course, the responsibility of development agencies will be to help. What should they do to help that? The second dimension is a little bit different. It's also linked to the SDGs, but the SDGs are different to the extent that they are not a developing country set of goals. They are goals for humanity, for all of us. They are global goals. Therefore, development assistance will have increasingly to do with the idea of partnering with developing countries to solve global problems. It was already the case. This is not a new idea. It was already the case before, but it's become even more urgent to think in those ways. And by the way, we in developed countries can learn, for example, urban management. In our countries, it is penalized by many rigidities. In developing countries, they will have to find solutions to problems that our cities also, to some extent, have to face. And we can learn from that. So this back and forth between developed countries' experience and developing countries' challenges and experience is something that is a little bit new. And to encourage that discovery process, we need to behave differently. And of course, the third dimension is what Bill Saves will tell us later on. I forgot the phrase, actually, the mixed coalition. Thank you very much. The idea of mixed coalition, of public-private partnerships modernized, if you wish. That is the fact that any issue, in order to be addressed, need to be addressed by a variety of very different actors. How to promote that, how to organize that, how can development agencies think of themselves not as doers, but as catalysts for others' actions. This is something that requires a lot of change. These are some of the questions that we are going to discuss and possibly behind that. To help us, we have a wonderful panel. Let me very briefly present them by alphabetical order. We are lucky to have with us Yuen Yuen Ang, who is assistant professor in political science at the University of Michigan. She's one of the winners of the essays, and she will share with us her views very shortly. We have Daniel Honig, who is a second winner of the essays, who is assistant professor of international development at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS. These two will guide us about what they think about the future of development agencies, and we will of course be challenging their ideas and views in the debate. Rodrigo Salvado, who is Deputy Director, Development Policy and Finance at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And let me take this opportunity to thank, through Rodrigo and his colleagues here in the room, the Gates Foundation for supporting this project. I think it's a wonderful opportunity to get ideas from outside the system, because sometimes it's a closed system in which the experts within the system talk about the system itself, and it's very, very valuable to broaden the debate about development assistance beyond the development practitioners and thinkers. Bill Safdov is a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development, where he works on issues on aid effectiveness notably. And thank you for hosting this meeting, Bill, in these new premises. When they are not so new now, but for me they are new. I used to know the old CGD. It was already fantastic, but this is a great place to be. Wade Jos Verbeek, who is advisor at the Office of the Senior Vice President for the 2030 Agenda, UN relationships and partnerships at the World Bank. Thanks for being with us, Jos. And finally, Wade Warren, who will join a little bit later, who is assistant to the administrator for the Bureau for Policy Planning and Learning at USAID. So wonderful panel, very wonderful, but I don't want them to speak too long. I want them to launch the debate, and I would very much like the audience and women in the audience, because as you could observe, we have one woman in the panel, but it's not enough, obviously. So I hope that overall we have some good gender balance, and I would encourage all of you, including women, to talk and speak very highly and share your views and insights. So no more than 3-5 minutes for the opening comments, so that we can start a conversation with the audience. Thank you very much, and let me turn to Yuen to launch with her comments.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I want to start by warmly thanking the Global Development Network and the Center for Global Development for hosting this terrific event to bring new ideas to the table. And it is a real pleasure for me to participate in this conversation, and moreover to represent women and represent political scientists, and I do not know what other categories I might represent. But in any case, I'm really happy to be here. I'm a political scientist at the University of Michigan, and my research looks at how we can create the right conditions for effective adaptation. So in the past years, we have seen a very encouraging shift in the aid community, as Mr. Jacquet has pointed out, toward adaptive management, toward local ownership, toward the idea of replacing best practices with a best fit approach. I stress, however, that prescription does not equal practice, which means that it is one thing to tell aid agencies that they should adapt, but it is another thing to tell them how they can adapt, right? And the how question is the difficult question, but it is also the critical question. So my GDN essay brings attention to the how question. So yesterday at a panel at Brookings, I discussed one problem of promoting adaptation in aid agencies, and I highlighted the problem of evaluation. So in general, we like best practices because they're simple and they make evaluation easy. So there's a set of best practices. If you follow them, you're right. If you don't follow them, you're wrong, right? So, but if we encourage aid agencies to set aside these best practices and try to develop best fit solutions, then the problem is, how can aid professionals tell what fits or what doesn't fit, right? Who's right or who's wrong? So in order to create the conditions for aid agencies to go local, we first have to deal with this evaluation problem. And in my essay, I suggested one possible way of dealing with this problem, and that is to carve experimental pockets within 8 agencies. That is to create special teams that are tasked to apply local knowledge to solve local problems. And I argue that this strategy of experimentation is a lot more practical than trying to change the entire organization at once. And I also stress that I'm not saying that we should throw away best practices, because there are certain technical problems where best practices can solve, such as building a bridge or managing bank accounts. But there are many non-technical problems in the developing country for which we do not have best practices. For example, how do we organize corruption so that it is predictable? How do we use religion to protect women's rights? And how do we work with local strongmen so that they would provide public goods? So these are the types of problems for which we do not have best practices, and we need to develop specialists who are able to develop best fit solutions for these types of problems. So in addition to evaluation, and I will try to keep my remarks very short, I just wish to highlight a second necessary condition for achieving creative localized aid. And that is, we need to learn how to build markets with weak institutions. And that is a counterintuitive proposition, I realize. So bear with me. The reason for this is that once you get down to the local context in rural, traditional, poor settings, the conditions, the solutions that feed this context will inevitably have to build on their pre-existing practices, which to the normal eye will usually look corrupt, backward, or weak. So if we hold on to this belief that only our best practices are good and everything else is bad, then you will miss the solutions even when it is right in front of your eyes, right? So of course the question is, but can we really build markets with weak institutions? Because this sounds like a bizarre proposition, because we normally believe that we can only build markets with strong institutions, right? So in my new book, which is called How China Escaped the Poverty Trap, that is released by Cornell University Press, I lay out the historical process of how development actually happens. And I show you that the first step of this process is actually to build markets with weak institutions. And this happens not only in China, but in other developing and developed countries. So let me just give you a flavor of my argument. China has plenty of examples of building markets with a variety of wrong institutions. So for example, when China first opened markets, it stimulated markets not with private property rights, but with communal property rights. China did not use technocratic state agencies. It deliberately used non-specialized, non-impartial, and corruption-prone bureaucracies. And then Nigeria provides another example. We normally think about Nigeria as a poor, failed, and corrupt state, but it is less known that Nigeria has produced the world's third largest film industry. This is known as Nollywood. There's Hollywood, Bollywood, and then Nollywood. So if you think about it, it's quite amazing. How can a poor country with non-existent IPR protection produce a thriving film industry? And the answer is that the local filmmakers in Nigeria exploited piracy as an informal marketing and distribution tool. So they took a weak institution and they turned it into an advantage. And so finally, if you argue that this is not what happened in the West, I will also show you that, in fact, the West had also built markets with weak institutions, except you have to look further back in history when the West was developing. So in late medieval Europe, for example, regional markets had emerged through the use of communal property rights, not private property rights. And this is a system that we will see 5 centuries later in China in the 1980s. So taken together, all of these examples goes to show that historically, we have built markets with weak institutions. And in fact, we almost certainly have to do so, because developing countries start with weak institutions. So things like corruption, communal relations, piracy, these problems are not going away. And instead, I would argue that the 8 agencies of tomorrow have to learn how to use these weak institutions to catalyze development. So in conclusion, I believe there is tremendous room for progress if we can tailor aid to local conditions, if we can invest in local ownership. I also believe that there is tremendous creativity in the poorest parts of the world, because I have been there, I have seen it for myself, and I hope to bring some of these stories to you. But in order to be able to build on these opportunities, I would argue that we need to first reform aid agencies internally. And we also need to challenge some fundamental assumptions of how development actually happens. So thank you very much again.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yuen. Of course, a big question behind what you said is who is we? When you say we should reform aid agencies, who is the we? Is it we in this room? I think we could agree that they need to be reformed, but how does it happen? And I hope we can spend some time at some point about that issue. Thanks for pointing these two main important issues of localizing assistance much more than has been done in the past. Of course, GGN's solution for that is to mobilize the local researchers so that they can help produce the local knowledge and help actually own the part of the global knowledge that is relevant for them as well. And the second issue, of course, is how to help institutional and social change locally, knowing that it has to be driven by the existing elites and they might be imperfect and corrupted. So how do we get around that difficulty? Let me recommend a very, very powerful book written by Douglas North, John Wallis, and Barry Weingast in 2009 called Violence and Social Orders, which discusses this complex process of change in a very, very powerful way. Dan, your turn.
Thank you. And let me echo Yuen in thanking you and GDN, as well as the Gates Foundation and the Center for Global Development for this very kind honor and for convening this event. So as long as we're talking about books, Pierre, maybe I'll open by quoting James Q. Wilson, a famous American political scientist, who once said, "There are only 2 kinds of people who think organizations don't matter: economists and everyone else," right? And what he meant by that is that economists, in his mind, often make the mistake of thinking that what an organization does is transform inputs into outputs and not looking inside the black box of what's going on in the organization. Whereas the rest of us are very clear on the idea that organizational culture and the people within it matter deeply to what happens because we interact with organizations and work within organizations every day. But we sometimes make the mistake of thinking that means that there is no systematic component to what we experience, that it's all about the people and who's there in the sense of that being a random occurrence, the person who happens to be across the table from us. And my work argues that, of course, organizations are systematically affecting what happens in terms of these outcomes. And that's as true in development organizations as it is anywhere else. And so what I do in my essay is I draw upon my research, which looks at 14,000 projects across 9 donors, across 40 years, as well as some carefully selected case studies, to ask when, where, and why different organizational features have different kinds of systematic associations with the outcomes of development projects. And what I argue is that, what I find and what I argue is that autonomy matters. And autonomy matters most when, to echo Yuen, the sort of technology of the work is least predictable. When we don't have known blueprints that we're implementing, but rather we're trying to draw the blueprint as we try to execute it at the same time, right? And additionally, autonomy helps us more when we have recipient country environments that are more likely to change. When what we predict today is not going to be what the situation looks like 5 years from now. And often in development, I would say the vast majority of the time in development, we find ourselves in one or both of these kinds of contexts, either not knowing precisely what's going to work best, or knowing what might work best, but being in an environment where the situation is changing as we implement the project. And we know what we're writing in our PAD is not going to be what we find 5 years later when we come to do review. So I argue that what we need to do is decentralize more control, and that means not just formal responsibility for decision making, but real control over what happens. And that also involves thinking about the people who are at the front end of the organization's mission. That the way to bridge the global and the local is to give more control within the organization to those closest to the local who have access to global knowledge within their organizations, in a way that I think is quite consistent both with Gates's vision and with Jim Kim's vision of the World Bank as a knowledge bank with local embedded actors who are, or perhaps somebody else's vision. A solutions bank, I'm sorry. A solutions bank drawing on global knowledge to find local solutions. And we need to think about who those specialists, in Yuen's words, are going to be at the front of that organization. We need to think about human resource policy. We need to think about recruitment. We need to think about retention. We need to think about career concerns. And if we don't, all the formal changes in organizational structure we might want are not going to result in actual changes on the ground in how the organization functions. So to Pierre's question, and in closing, how do we get there? My answer, unsurprisingly for an academic, I suppose, is data. We talk a lot about experimentation in development, and what we normally mean is experimenting in terms of technology on the ground. But I suggest that what we need to do is experiment organizationally, right? Have trials, have observational data on different ways of implementing our projects, on different ways of incentivizing our staff, on different ways of structuring the development apparatus. And let's see what happens. Let's start by treating this as an experimental project with the notion that we will broaden it as far and as fast as the data warrants doing so. And in the end, we'll end up with a better sense of what it means to implement in a better way in our organizations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. From my 10 years in one of the French bilateral development, the French bilateral development organization, French development agency, I can tell you that these ideas are very often discussed, but that institutions are very conservative, and that bringing in change is a process that is very time-consuming and costly, and it takes years. So in a way, the question to discuss is how to implement the kind of solution that you have in mind in a light way that is not going to absorb much of the time and energy of the institutions. Let's store that for the debate. Let me turn to Jos. You are in an institution that is quite often reforming. So you will help us understand how that happens and how that deals with the issues that have been discussed already of bridging the local and the global, bridging knowledge and practice, experimenting new things. So your turn. Thank you,
Pierre. And again, it's a pleasure to be here. Being from a global financial institutions, you should not be surprised I'm going to talk about global issues and about financial issues. No? And some of these internal reorganization issues, maybe we can talk about during Q&A or things like that. But I think on what's important from the from a multilateral perspective, I think, where we want to talk about what are some of these global challenges that we are going to face looking forward, and what are some of the real differences that we see, which are there now that we are not there during the MDG implementation. Because now we are in the 1990s, we agreed on the Millennium Development Goals, 8 goals, about 24 targets, 60 indicators. Now we have basically agreed on a framework of sustainable development goals, a universal, holistic framework, where we have 17 goals, 169 targets, 230 or something indicators to monitor. It's a very different agenda. But at the same time, also the global economy is very different, that we are in a global challenges that we face is very different today. And I think when you think about how aid agencies should behave in the future, or what are the challenges they face, it's important, I think, to look at some of these and to take them into account. So I would like to put forward today, we have a real issue going forward with demography. We have aging societies, many more in the middle income countries or high income countries. Well, at the same time, where we see, in particular Africa, we see a large youth bulge emerging with still very high population growth. In some countries, even 6 children per woman. And we have to deal with it because that's where not only the poverty is, but that's of course also where we then have to create the jobs for these people to lift them out of poverty. So the challenges are, one is of demography. Another one I would say is the evolution of globalization. Really the rise of middle income countries as a share of global GDP. If you look at the 1990, if you would, I'm an economist, so we like to look at income distributions. If you look at the income distribution for the global economy in 1990, it basically looks like a camel. You have 2 peaks. One is the peak of the developing countries, and the other peak, you can argue, was for developed countries. If you look at the global income distribution today, there's only 1 peak. Yeah, we had a camel, now we have a dromedary. Or dromedary, what is the right? So that also, in a sense, means something for the international aid community. Why? Because if you remember some of these theories about public choice and medium voter, importance of the medium voter, then here, of course, also these emerging countries want to be more important in the global economy. They want to be more important in global institutions. They want to also be more important in the World Bank. And I think as an observer during the negotiations, I think for the third Financing for Development conference in Addis Ababa, as well as the SDG agenda, we really saw that these emerging economies really want to have more voice. And there, I think, will be one of the things going forward. It's one thing to have more voice, but it's also another thing, of course, to step up and take more responsibility for global actions. And I think going forward, I think the multilateral system is one of the challenges I think we're going to face. How are we going to accommodate more voice for these emerging economies, but at the same time, how are we also put more accountability and responsibility on top of their actions so that they really indeed contribute to the attainment, say, of the SDGs, of ending poverty, preserving the planet, and while leaving no one behind. The third challenge I wanted to raise is the one of urbanization. I think this one is well known. Within 20 years, by 2030, basically, we are expecting that 60% of developing countries' population will live in urban areas. And it's a real economic challenge that we have to deal with. Currently, it's about, I think it's 48, somewhere around 50. But basically, the complete increase of population over the next 15, 20 years will happen in urban areas. And we better be ready for it, to handle these things. Climate change, I think I don't have to say too much about that. I think it's well known. And then, of course, fragility and conflict. And its associated spillovers have major regional and global implications. And also for development assistance and the way that we organize with international development support. Now, these challenges and ambitions of the SDGs, and that's the second point I want to make, is about financing. The current international financing structure to support development or through official development assistance, which has been hovering around $130, $135 billion a year, is not going to be able to support the implementation and the attainment of the SDGs. So also there, we really have to think differently about how we want to support and how we want to bring finance to the developing world. The grand bargain that was done, in a sense, in Monterey was the thing that, okay, if developing countries focus on MDG implementation, the developed countries will really focus on growth and focus on providing ODA for implementation of the MDGs. Yeah, because at that time it was still thought that developed countries, if they grow fast, then developing countries can export to these developed countries. It will increase their markets, it will help them to grow. And at the same time, if then the developed world provides more ODA, official development assistance, to developed countries, we can help them really implement the MDGs. It was really the thought that ODA was enough to implement the MDGs. It's very clear that for the SDGs, it's not. So there we have to have a sort of a thought revolution. Yeah? We have to understand that ODA is not going to bring the train even probably out of the station to implement the SDGs, because it requires trillions a year. And that's why, in a sense, the World Bank Group, together with the MDBs, wrote a paper about a year ago, which is, I think, is now known as billions for trillions, or from billions to trillions. We need to go from billions that we currently have in development assistance, we need to get to the trillions to help to attain the SDGs agenda. And that really requires a different approach. We cannot just do it with ODA, we need to really leverage ODA. We need to use ODA to mobilize other resources. And there are basically, I think, two ways by which we really need to focus on. One is to mobilize international financial resources. If you just think about it, of how many trillions are out there in assets that are trying to invest in T-bills, which basically have negative returns, why are we not able to de-risk development projects to be able to attract these resources and actually make some return on this type of investment? That should be possible. That should really be an international effort to mobilize these resources and bring them to developing countries or emerging economies to help implement the investments that are necessary to attain the SDGs. And secondly, I think what is also very much important is for us to ask, in a sense, developing countries also to make an effort to improve their tax mobilization, of their domestic resource mobilization. And we need to make a much more coherent effort to improve tax administration and tax policies in these countries. So there also, I think there's an initiative between the World Bank and the IMF to really start going to countries and to start helping them to make an assessment of their current tax administration and tax policies, and try to help them to increase the domestic resource mobilization by at least a few percent, or at least, particularly in fragile states and low-income countries, we want to lift it to somewhere above 15%. So these are the two things I think we are focusing. I think that's really, we have the global challenges. They are different than they were during the MDG. The world is changing. And I'm sure we will get another certain things coming out of left field, or things that we currently are not foreseeing that are important for us to take into account. And secondly is really, the point I want to make is on financing. And you see already now, actually, we have currently in a lot of the bank senior management is gathered in Myanmar to discuss IDA 18. IDA is our International Development Assistance, is our fund and resources for the least developed countries, or the low-income countries in our definition. And really there also, you see the shift is really going from just purely financing to the real request by our donors to say, okay, what are you doing to mobilize private resources in IDA countries? So we are discussing with our donors to make sure that we involve IFC, which is our private sector arm, and we have MIGA, which is doing a lot of the de-risking of political risk or other risk in developing countries for project implementation, to really bring them into the IDA, and we're going to put significant resources behind there to make sure that that happens. And similar is also that then the focus of IDA itself, that it wanted to increase its leveraging from, I think at the moment, leveraging in IDA is about 1 to 2. So if you give us $1, we turn it into 2, and they want to increase it from 1 to 3. So there's a lot of thinking going on about how these global development issues, of course, you know, the global challenges are there, but also how, in a sense, on the financing side, we as a global financial institution need to get to it and really start becoming more of an institution that mobilizes resources than that it really provides $1 from its grants to developing countries. Thank you, Pierre.
Thank you very much. Let me store two remarks for the debate later on. One is this question of using global finance or bilateral finance to de-risk some investments, which I think is a very, very promising idea. It requires a lot of competences, because if markets are able to evaluate the risk properly, we shouldn't de-risk. So the rationale for de-risking is when one believes that markets are overestimating the risk, then there is a case for development agencies to step in and take part of the risk that is unduly valued by markets. And this sharing of risk is a very complex issue. It requires a lot of competencies in risk valuation and risk management that one can find in financial institutions, but not in all development institutions. So that's a big challenge in terms of evolution of the development institutions. On domestic resource mobilization, a major issue will be how to conciliate domestic resource mobilization with poverty reduction locally. And there is a major project that is worth looking at, undertaken by Nora Lustig, called the Commitment to Equity Index, the CEQ. And the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is funding a major evolution of that project into a CEQ institute, in which the team assembled by Nora looks at how public finance has incidence on poverty. And I think it's really crucial to understand that, to make sure that domestic resource mobilization is also compatible with the objective of inequality and poverty reduction locally. Thank you very much. Wade, I know you arrive a bit late, but thanks for coming, and can I turn to you? The discussion so far has been guided by two of the winning essays in the competition that were organized with funding from the Gates Foundation on the next horizons and modernizing development assistance. And basically, the idea was how to bridge the local and the global, and how to create space for experimentation in developing development agencies to be closer to the field and to listen more to the field.
Thank you. First, I want to offer my apologies for arriving late. I was in a meeting with the USAID administrator about the 2018 budget, which will be taken up by our next president, whoever he or she might be. So it had a bit of a surreal quality to it, but it's still something we have to do. So I got caught up in that and wasn't able to be here timely, and I do apologize for that. And as for payment, I got a microphone that doesn't work, a lapel microphone that doesn't work. So I'm holding the microphone, the handheld microphone. But I'm glad to be here, and I did want to say a few things about how we in USAID think about the future of a development agency and how we need to change in the coming years. And some of my thoughts are very similar to the ones you just heard from the World Bank, so I won't belabor them. But I will note that we're very obviously aware that there are many more actors now than there were in international development, and that foreign assistance or official development assistance, while in the case of the United States is not actually shrinking, it's staying fairly constant, it is becoming a much smaller proportion of the total resources that are available to countries for development. So we are aware that the terrain and the world that we operate in is changing rapidly, but we don't view that with concern. We think it presents opportunities for us as an agency, and we welcome the changes that we're seeing. When we think about the future of USAID, we think of it very much in a post-financing for development context, the Addis Ababa conference last year. And as my colleague was just saying, we recognize that the function of development assistance in the future needs to be much more about catalyzing other kinds of resources than trying to fund projects as we sort of have historically done. So we look at really three broad sources of assistance for countries going forward. One is official development assistance, which I think will continue to provide from the United States at levels similar to what we have in the past. The second is the private sector, and we have as an agency a fair amount of experience leveraging and working with the private sector, so doing public-private partnerships together we think is part of the key to the future. But then as you just heard, the real gold mine for countries in the coming years is from their own domestic resources, which are increasing dramatically in the cases of some countries, and we think that our assistance can play an important role in leveraging those domestic resources. As we think about how do we have to change as an agency, I think there are a lot of things that we need to do differently and better than we have in the past. And I was going to mention just three of them, three things that we're working on currently. One is being more flexible and adaptive as we implement our programs. And in the past, I think we were criticized with some justification probably for procuring or designing a program and procuring it in such a way that kind of locked us into an approach. And even if it became evident during the implementation of the program that we were on the wrong track, it was difficult to change in midstream. And so we're being much more intentional now about what we call adaptive management, so that we can build in flexible processes, and as we evaluate and look at programs in midstream, if there are changes that need to be made to them, we're building in greater flexibility around trying to implement those kinds of changes. So the embracing an adaptive management style of program management is one of the key changes that we're trying to make in the agency. Another one that I struggle with and we spend time thinking about is how to better use evidence and data. And I feel as an agency, we are just awash in data. I don't think we do as good a job as we should of mining it and visualizing it and organizing it and using it for decision making and for telling our story about the work that we're doing. So we have a lot of work ahead of us, I think, around data management and using data more effectively. And then the last thing that I was going to mention, which was also mentioned by the World Bank, is issues around risk. And if we're going to move into a world where we're working with other and new partners, we're potentially making cash transfers to entities that haven't received them from us in the past. We as an agency have a very, I would say, low tolerance for financial risk. We are signaled by Congress that it's not okay to lose any money, which is, of course, quite understandable. But we need to balance this very, very low tolerance for financial risk with programmatic risk and reputational risk and the other kinds of the ways that we design programs to make them more effective. And so we have a very deliberate process underway right now to look at our risk posture and see if there are ways that we can be smarter about project designs that will allow us to take a chance and possibly have a big payoff while still keeping in mind the low tolerance that we have for financial risk. So those are just three things that I wanted to offer as the kinds of things that we're thinking about as an agency as we look to the future.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for insisting on this sort of contradiction, because on the one hand, development agencies use taxpayers' money and they are not allowed to risk this taxpayers' money. So there's a lot of risk aversion, a lot of time spent to avoid risk in development agencies. And at the same time, development is about risk. Any economic development is about taking risks. So this contradiction is something that is very difficult to bridge. And what is nice about the current opportunities, indeed, is that they oblige all of us to think more in terms of risk management and to find ways around that constraint. Rodrigo, how can philanthropy solve all these issues?
Well, no. We actually support you to actually solve it. So thank you very much for this, and I think that congratulations also on the essay. I think that all of them, not just the winners, are great. I think that just to bring a perspective from the foundation, and also again support for the type of thinking that we're doing, and what we are hearing here. I think that one of the things that we are looking at the foundation is about not only the agency of the future, but the A system of the future. I think that one of the things that we are facing right now is that there's an array of conversation happening at the same time. So you have the IDA-18 discussions, back to the African Development Fund replenishment happening. You have the World Bank forward-looking exercise, which is a strategic exercise going to be undertaken. You have the Global Fund replenishment going on. You have ODA redefinition happening in Paris. You have so many things that right now are actually about the future of the development architecture. And then what it seems to me is that we spend a lot of time trying to get a huge consensus on the demand side, right? The 2030 agenda. We have the SDG agenda. But we have not spent enough time on leading a consensus on the supply side. So when you see, and everyone say, well, Rodrigo, how the foundation will fit here? We say, well, it would be great that we all together get together and say, you know what is the system and what are the things that we are facing and how each of us can complement to each other. Because then when you see someone say, it's refugees, all go there. No, tomorrow is the other thing. So there are a couple of things that we are looking as trends that I think it will be very important to change as principles for a new aid system. And I'm not saying the aid system for the next 30 years. History, is actually teaching us that you need to fix for it's like for 10 years or maybe much less, And one of the things that we're doing is obviously this idea of the new geography or map of needs. So as we were saying, you have right now, before you put your finger, say really poor countries or really a poor continent is where we have to go. This is where poor people is, this is where they need, that it is. Then it was, these are the poor countries is where we want to go. Right now, no matter which measure of poverty you use, I like multidimensional poverty most, but if you like income poverty, most of the poor people is actually outside low-income countries or LDCs. So most of the poor people in the world is outside what the country classifies as poor countries, which it doesn't mean that you still need to focus on this. But it's something which is a reality that you need to do. If you look at the Gates Foundation, we work in Nigeria, Pakistan, Bangladesh, many of the countries which actually are lower middle income countries. So I think one of the things is saying how you're going to react to that. And I have to say on the positive side, we are getting to that by facing other things. On refugees, we don't not act on refugees in Turkey just because Turkey happens to be a lower middle income country. We just go there because the needs are there. So we are driven by the needs, we are driven by the interventions, not so much corseted by these country classifications. So that's one of the things that we had to figure out, how we were more flexible to actually deliver there. And for us, for the foundation, perhaps it's easier to do. The question is not whether we should do, it's how we do it. So it's not if, it's how, right? So we know we have to go and act in these countries. The question is how we're going to do it to build the right incentives and everything. I think the second point that we are chasing, and I think that is also good for the system itself, is how we organize around function instead of topics. So today is the refugees, but we don't stop to say what are the structural things of the refugees that can be replicated tomorrow for whatever that global threat is. Because we are just solving for refugees. Next year might be something else, and we are running behind, so we are always running behind. The system is always running behind because we are organizing around topics rather than functions. So function is around prevention, function is around global public goods, function is around country, but these kind of things are the ones that we have. And I would say the last thing, and I think there is a new context that we can launch perhaps, we are talking about this issue of catalyzing money, private sector. We don't have a taxonomy of what it is. We don't have a taxonomy of, okay, you mobilize that money, but what actually is the kind of money that we need to actually solve this problem? What is the kind of market failure that is going to require public money? What is our new narrative for ODA? Because, for example, what we know in the foundation, we have to get more sophisticated of what the ODA is. We cannot keep saying ODA is important. We have to be more sophisticated and say ODA is important for doing this. But at the foundation, as it was USAID, we know from a PRI invested, it's not everything. Private sector is not going to come to whatever random idea we have and just go there and solve the problem that we have. It's true. We have a lot of PRI which are failure, right? And the reason is because people say, no, it's okay, private sector will come. So we have changed innovative finance for private sector, right, as the panacea for all the things that we are not going to do. So it is good, and I agree that we have to mobilize resources. But once we catalyze those resources, the question is for what? So once we have that kind of those guiding principles, then we say, okay, now, for example, the Gates Foundation is much better doing preparedness for pandemics, right? And then there's another function to work more on the reaction. The Gates Foundation, because it's a philanthropic organization, is ready to take more risk. And we don't have to, so we can go first. But then we need someone to scale up that, because it's impossible that we are going to take it all the way to the bankable size. So I think that these are the type of conversation I think is like, it would be great to have this sort of specific solutions within a context. We say, well, this is our vision as we go together and sit together to agree on the demand, agree on what is needed on the demand side. This is what we want to land as a development compact. And again, I think that with Pierre, we were just discussing, it has to have like the vision of the developing countries. It's actually, I mean, if you talk about, we're discussing with Ghana, we're discussing with other countries saying, well, you know what, we really need, they know what the kind of financing they need. They know, how they have to do, and how, much better than perhaps us on what we have to use for what. So I think those are the kind of questions, obviously not bringing any solutions, but that I think is where the debate should be evolving. And we are looking at that at the foundation. We are looking at with partners, I think is enormous. And how we work with partners to actually solve this, I think is important. And the last comment I will make, we have it's a very, very narrow window we have. Again, I'm going to say what between now and the next 12 months, there's a huge amount of decisions that are going to be happening. So I think that the challenge for us is how to get, our act together, in terms of like basically informing those decisions before actually happen, and we have to wait until 3 years for the next either replenishment or whatever it is in 4 years. So, more questions?
Thank you very much. Just one short comment. When you say that they know better than we do about their financing needs, I mean, obviously not always, because they can be poorly governed and so on. But at the same time, we are in a system which hardly tolerates failure. And we think that the responsibility of development agencies is to avoid mistakes made by the beneficiaries of the grants and loans that are made by development agencies. At the same time, it's hard to understand how people can learn without failing. So we are again here in another sort of contradiction about how to train people in adapting good practices if we do not tolerate failure to teach people that these good practices make sense, for example. So that's something that also you may have comments later on to share. Finally, let me turn to a global think tank. Bill, can you guide us about how you think that the themes have evolved over the years on this question of development assistance, and what are the major subjects that CGD would like to either studies or would like to study on this global set of issues?
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think what I want to start, since I'm the one person on the panel from the Center for Global Development, is welcome everybody. You know, that I'm glad you're here. And I know Nancy Birdsall would have loved to be here, not only because she cares about this topic, but also because she served on the
jury.
She
was the
chaired
chair of
the jury that selected these wonderful papers. So this was something that was close to her heart. And we're really glad to be partnering with the Global Development Network and Gates on this stuff. This is, you know, as you've pointed out, these huge decisions are going on. There's a lot of foment about how this is all changing, so we're very much engaged in this and happy to see this going forward. I kind of actually would like to pick up a little bit on what Rodrigo said at the end and Pierre there, is that mentioning the developing countries themselves, because this seems to me it ties back to what Dan and Yuen were saying about development is local. It's people identifying their own problems and solving them. We know that's when development happens. It's not when somebody comes from outside with a diagnostic and a plan and expertise. And so what I would want to say is, thinking about what the aid agencies of the future should be, is to basically ask how we would make sure that agency, as it were, is with countries themselves. That aid agencies don't make countries develop. No one can make a country develop. Only a country can develop itself. That happens from within. And so I think the points that Yuen and Dan are making about autonomy, best fit, are essentially the way an aid agency can be supportive to a domestic process, thinking in terms of projects or reforms in that nature. But when the panel asked the big question of what should aid agencies look like in the future, I kind of have to sort of shift more in the direction like Yusuf was saying, is what's the big picture that we're looking for in the next 15 years? And aid agencies are really organizations that are instruments for making foreign assistance happen. So what's the kind of foreign assistance we need? And when I think about that, the biggest point in my thing that comes to my mind is most countries are going to be wealthier and more functional in the future. And yet the gap between richer and poorer countries is going to continue to be an order of magnitude larger than regional disparities within countries. And we have systems, like in large federated countries like the US, we have systems for redistributing, for providing support to weaker states or counties or things like that. And we don't think about the world that way. But essentially that's the world we're moving toward, a world where all countries are sort of in this continuum. And foreign assistance isn't really a country that's up here to a country that's down there, but it's to peers, peer to peer. And so if I were to answer this question, where should aid agencies go? I would say, what kind of an organization of foreign assistance does the US or the Europeans or the wealthier countries need to do to transition to that new world? And there are basically three big tasks in that world. There are public goods, and that's providing information and networking without the dollars. It's not playing this game that they'll only take our expertise if we give them a loan or a grant. It's providing the information without the dollars attached. It's data standards, not reporting requirements. It's epidemiological surveillance. It's things like international regulations on beneficial ownership that make financial transactions more transparent. So it's a whole series of things that countries are already collaborating on, but our aid agencies aren't necessarily playing a role in these things that actually have huge impact on the capacity and ability for a country to develop itself. And so it seems to me that the aid agencies of the future are going to be ones that actually are acting as liaisons between their own governments, their own departments of health, their own financial institutions, and either the global governance institutions that are doing this, say an IMF, or as I mentioned in an earlier comment, mixed coalitions where you have these groups of countries and philanthropies and civil society groups blending together to try to take on a task that the global governance institutions may have failed at. The second category is crisis response. And this is, I think, for me, the paradigmatic cases are Haiti after the earthquake and the Syrian civil war right now. There are cases where you need humanitarian response with development and with resettlement. And this is the area where I think most of the discussion about autonomy, best fit, begins to make sense, because that's actually closer to blending what an international agency can bring in terms of logistics and financing with what really need to be locally driven problem solving in the country. And I think that's a hard nut to crack, but if the aid agencies were focused more in those situations, I think that they could build that. And that's the other second aspect of the aid agency of the future. And then the third characteristic is redistribution. That it doesn't make sense for an aid agency to be going to a country as capable as China or India or even Nigeria and telling them how they should be doing their social safety net. And yet, the gap between wealthy and poor countries is still huge, and there's a role for redistribution of resources. And those can either take the form of direct services, so it might be a direct cash transfer, income support for poor people in middle-income countries, the way Give Directly is trying to pilot right now in Kenya, or health insurance payment premiums in countries that actually have functioning health insurance systems. Or it could be a kind of a block grant approach, which is the way often federated systems hand block grants to their states or their provinces. And then a whole question about what the political accountability is for those block grants, which I could go on at length, but for those of you who know my work on cash on delivery, but I won't go there. So how to get there? I think that the SDGs are already a huge advance because they basically say we're all in this together. It's that one hump camel, and that's a huge change in the language. I think that the incremental approaches that Dan Yuen have suggested are definitely things worth doing and worth trying. I tend to think bigger and want to, when I'm thinking of a 15-year time frame, I want bigger change faster. And I think that only happens when you actually create new institutions. But we've seen DFID reorganize tremendously in the late 90s. It made a huge shift toward a much more flexible and innovative organization, so it can be done. The Swedes have reclassified their funding and focused on fewer countries. That's something that I think all the agencies have to do. They've shown it can be done. The US created MCC as an alternative model, and I think that that's another example of how you can make these things roll. So to me, that's the roadmap, and I think there's sort of an implicit charity and paternalism vision in our aid agencies, the way they were founded and structured, and we have to move toward a world that's really much more about collaboration, providing services to clients, and redistributing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thank you for your patience. The floor is now with you. Please be brief, briefly introduce yourself when you take the floor, and you're welcome to make comments and not only to ask questions, provided there are comments on the subject of the meeting, of course. Yes, your turn. And is there a microphone that circulates? Or yeah, thank you. Can you come here? Yeah, just here. Thank you. The lady here in the second row.
Thank you all, extremely illuminating and catalytic. My name is Mindy Reiser. I'm a sociologist and vice president of an organization called Global Peace Services USA. I want to ask about the whole concept of grand challenges. Obviously, that is not the total contour of an aid agency, but it's certainly become very popular, started by some foundations, taken up by some governments. Has anyone assessed the difference these grand challenges have made? An awful lot of money has been at play here. They've tackled particularly work and health, but other areas. And what kind of new thinking has that generated? Is that something that should be a component of rethinking how aid is conceptualized and delivered?
Thank you very much. Yes. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. My name is Mary McNeil. I'm an independent consultant formerly with the World Bank. My question goes to what is going to be done with these very rich papers that have been produced, two of which we heard about now. And I didn't hear, frankly, a lot of direct response to the suggestions made from the two papers from our representatives from the multilateral and the donor agencies. Except I do think, William, you actually addressed the issue and put forward some responses. So what's the next step? Because I think there's a great opportunity here for the agencies to learn from this. So what are you proposing?
Thank you very much. Yes, 2 persons here. Don't fight. Don't fight. Don't fight.
Yeah, I am Hasan Karim. I am Bangladeshi US American. I am architect of developing Bangladesh, sustainable development in Bangladesh. I asked Ong that how you relate your hypothesis with British Industrial Revolution.
Okay.
Thank you. Mark Cohen from Oxfam. So for our solutions banker, you talked about domestic resource mobilization in fragile states. Then I think about your list at the bank of fragile states, and I know the devil is in the details, but if you could get into some of those devilish details about what that would look like in some of the fragile states on that list, that would help. And if I could ask also Professor Ang, so you talk about using the weak institutions, and then, when I studied China back in grad school some decades ago, there was a very strong institution, the Communist Party. So how does that jibe with the communal level? I mean, yes, weak institutions, but the strong and the weak together, is that maybe a little different from Nigeria?
Yeah, then we need to discuss how to define weak and strong
Yes.
when you talk about institutions. Yes, sir. And then you and you, madam.
Hi, my background is in structured finance and risk, and I've done development projects in different countries. And I just want to go back to what Pierre started the session with. Kindly, he said 2 things. Well, focus on the how, and also who is we, and as opposed to who will do it, right? And I think one suggestion, if I may offer, is one way to do the evaluation is to see whether the objectives laid out for the discussion how were they achieved by each speaker. And you can evaluate them by the number of solutions provided. And going back to what the first 2 authors provided as solutions, which I think need to be looked at very carefully, about autonomy, decentralization, and looking at local conditions. I didn't really find that those really got addressed at all. And that is the issue, how do we get people to look at them and talk about it in detail? Even the language is different. The conceptual understanding that the listeners have didn't seem to correlate to what you were saying, Professor Yuen. So I mean, the local conditions are quite rich and diverse in these countries, but the approach is very much, they already have a best practice, normal fit toolkit that gets applied. So what the next step, I mean, I've thought these through. I mean, I think I have the answers, but if they're not coming forth and not ready for the change, then that is the challenge. So the we issue keeps coming up, who will do it? I mean, one answer I got to the we issue, I've asked several people several times, right? And they said, look, we means, I means the person who has the funds and the job. He said, well, I get the funding and I get the job, and then you are the catalyst and you create the mobilization and change. you meaning the outsider who doesn't have the funding or the job or the organizational affiliation. So that is the organizational issue, right? Like, I mean, you can hope for all these things, but they won't happen. We haven't really addressed that. So how do we get new parties in to do that? Thank you.
Thank you. We may come back to that. Yes, sir. And then Madam, and then you, sir. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Name is Peter Matlin with Cornell University. It was a marvelous conversation, but without sounding cynical, frankly, you could have been reading from some of the transcripts of the process which led to the Paris Principles some 10 plus years ago.
Yep.
Many of the themes that you all seem to agree on were captured in the Paris Principles, either explicitly or between the lines, the intention. So the question I have is, as we are moving forward in the process of trying to revisualize the future of aid communities and aid agencies, have we systematically done an honest, rigorous diagnosis of what was implemented in the Paris Principles, more importantly, what was not implemented, and why? We risk reinventing a flat tire here unless we think carefully about the political economy in donor countries and donor agencies that pose constraints to doing precisely what it is that you've called for. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's quite refreshing and quite to the point. Yes.
Hi there, my name is Alima with the Public International Law and Policy Group. I wanted to ask a little bit about the point that you all have made in passing around innovation within your organizations, both organizationally and in terms of the implementation of the projects on the ground. How do you generate the will within agencies to be innovative and to experiment in a context in which there's a huge risk aversion, as you also mentioned, there's low appetite for failure, and in which there's limited resources? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will move to you, but there was for geographical coherence, I am going to, yes, unless a microphone can move very fast. Yes, go ahead. Thank you. Thank you very much. Sir, let's move, let's take a couple of them, and then we'll have to go back to the panel. I think, yeah, I think you will have your turn. Don't worry. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Peter Sturm. I used to work for the GTZ and the OECD. I would like to ask a question linking two of the statements from the panel. I think Professor An made a statement that in order to be successful, international development organizations have to adapt to the existing situation on the ground as it is, not as they would like it to be. And I think Mr. Savdorf said that all development has to start locally and has to be initiated and carried out by the local individuals. Now, sometimes conditions on the ground are such that locals are not empowered to do what they would like to do and that they would like to develop. And if you look at public sector governance as defined by the World Bank, it's very highly correlated with the level of development a country actually achieves. So it seems to me that development requires an improvement in public sector governance in many of the countries that are underdeveloped and that not developing rapidly. So my question then is, do international aid organizations have a role in helping underdeveloped countries to improve their public sector governance? And if that is the case, how can that best be done without smacking of cultural imperialism?
Thank you. Yes, sir. And then a final one. In the back, yes.
My name is Mohammed Punik. I'm retired from UN after 29 years. What we did see a shift to local solutions. At least I was with UNDP, and we moved away from projects being centrally authorized to being arranged at the local level. But it didn't lead to much actual change. And I mean, as somebody who's sort of been hitting his head against a brick wall for that entire period, whether you achieved results or not didn't change. It was only that before and after, you were only successful in countries where the local conditions were appropriate and where the local governments were supportive. And at the same time, I have seen the pressures that are operating, and donors themselves who fund these international organizations create conditions where these organizations cannot operate. Therefore, I doubt very much what the intention is there originally to start out with. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Final one in the back. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Ziad Liryani from Yemen. I worked on development there and with Yemeni NGOs. My question is about countries during conflict. So you mentioned how humanitarian used to be delivered at the same time in parallel to development. And my question is, have we learned anything in past years from working in conflict areas about best practices, and have NGO or INGOs developed and adapted to these areas where the government is becoming less of a player, apart from working with the private sector, when it comes especially more to humanitarian relief and long-term aid projects? Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, yes, sorry. Did I miss you? No, okay. Good.
My name is Nadia Naviwala. I'm a fellow at the Wilson Center, and I study USAID in Pakistan. I find it interesting to talk about aid agencies alone without talking about state or Congress. And this is similar to many other countries where aid agencies are increasingly being folded into foreign ministries. A lot of your comments, especially Ang, talked about the need to think politically, but our development agencies don't have a capacity or tools that are political, especially with the United States, maybe less so with some other agencies. And we're so constrained by Congress and by the rules around aid that I don't think we're really interested in learning and data at all, or even if we have it, can do much with it. Most of it is oriented on PR or communicating back to Congress, and there's a very high risk associated with bad data and bad evidence and putting it out there. So yeah, I just think we need to talk more about the context within which these aid agencies exist, which create the constraints that basically mean our talking points are at least 5 years old when it comes to USAID. We just can't do the things we know we need to do.
Okay, thank you very much. Most of these comments bring us back to some strong political economy considerations. Before giving the floor back to the panel, let me just comment briefly on the grand challenges, because one of the winning essays written by someone who is in the room behind you, Ray Kennedy, is on vertical funds. So that's actually funds created to address these grand challenges. And he argues that we should do more of them, and that development agencies are less effective and less efficient most of the time, and that they should invest more in the funds themselves. So we are not going to open fully that debate, but I just wanted to mention that idea, which is, of course, designed to be controversial as well. And it's one of the winning essays as well. So let me go back to the panel and ask them to elaborate a little bit on these various political economy constraints and considerations. Let me do it in the reverse order and start with you, Bill.
Okay, great. I think I'm going to respond to three of the questions, particularly kicked off by Peter Matlin's comment about the Paris Principles, and this is a long time. I mean, you can go even farther back.
Yes.
I was talking to somebody about the development of the logical framework,
yes,
which today is considered this rigid planning, straitjacket. And when you look at what they were writing about it and how they meant it to be used, it was an adaptive, flexible tool for setting out a plan, reviewing it quarterly if necessary, and adjusting, looking at the risks, managing the risks, and so forth. So I think that experience and the Paris Principles points out that the political economy of our aid system is such that it constantly drives itself toward best practices, as Yuen put it, and away from best fit. And a large part of that, Dan was saying this yesterday as well, is this need to report at a remove. In other words, you can't simply say, oh, well, we trust this guy who's at this office in this particular country to do a good job. That person has to send a report that has some kind of quantified numbers that convinces us that they've had an impact. So that's the dynamic that I see as anything that we propose is going to sort of always be fighting against. And here's where I will, pitch on my cash on delivery idea, which is that we need something that provides accountability for the use of donor funds, but removes the external agents from being in the soup, from being hands-on, and only showing up if somebody actually called them and said, oh, you happen to know how to set up a bank account, we'd like to learn how to do that. And so the principle there would be you pick broad topics, and here's my grand idea was you pick a country that's somewhat functional, may not be the highest ranked in terms of integrity, and you basically say we will disperse our funds annually against improvements in child mortality, literacy rates, access to energy, reductions in efficiency in energy use relative to climate change, and one other thing about maybe financial management. You don't hit everything, but you basically end up having the flow of funds go to that country against some high order, independently verified indicators. And then when you go to Congress or Parliament, you say, what did our money do? Well, it went to a country that improved child mortality and da-da-da-da, or our funding went down because they weren't doing as well. It's not a perfect solution, but it's the only way I can see to sort of revert the political economy issue. And I think this goes back to the point that was made about UNDP. If you really do, it's true, you focus on, things will be successful where the conditions locally are propitious, or where there's a particular social entrepreneur or politician who's going to make things go. But in our current system, that's still true. We just pretend that because we bought the inputs, because we spent the money, because we have the 6th electric energy generation project in Nigeria, somehow we were more successful. It's the same thing. It just sort of shows it for what it is. And the last point about USAID, it seems to me if the aid agencies were really focused in the crisis countries, they'd actually have more opportunity to do this best fit work. Partly Dan's point is that that's actually where they work better based on his paper. But USAID actually is much more flexible in Afghanistan than it is anywhere else. It has a performance agreement almost like a COD program with Afghanistan, and it has that liberty because everybody understands it's an urgent situation and Congress's meddling Congress can't meddle because it's a bigger, more problematic situation. Whereas in a country that's not in crisis, they want to make sure it doesn't deal with birth control, it doesn't have this thing, that it uses local and all that other kind of stuff. So to me, that's the big political economy story.
Thank you very much. Rodrigo.
Yeah, but just 2 minutes, conscious of time. So I would say on grand challenges, the experience the foundation has is very good. I think that one lesson learned from there is that you have grand challenges that the end of it is actually to have some exposure of like good thinkers to topics and also to audiences. The other ones that need, for example, reinventing the toilet or are about products, that you need to really partner who is going to come and pick up that to scale up the product. So I think that right now, the role of institutions like IFC, the role of institutional banks is extremely important, and we are partnering with them in order to try to actually provide that sort of scale-up facility for these entrepreneurs. So on grassroots organizations, there's the CEO of the foundation just issued the annual letter, and she's referring to one program that we have, which is the tobacco tax program, and this is only 3 people in the foundation that runs that program. And if you look at the experience that we have in the Philippines, right, it's amazing. It's fantastic how, the amount of things that we could achieve, but it's that only done through local actors, only through that. So I recommend that's a very good thing. And I think that takes me to the adaptability and the change. I think the foundation came from vaccine delivery, right, and now we are getting to things like tobacco taxation, which is totally different. The political economy is different, from the forces are different. But we still have that sort of approach when we try to think what is our added value, what we're going to do, and basically what we spend and what our theory of change is. And we adapt our function and adapt our investment to that end. And I think obviously it's easier for us to do it because of the philanthropic character of it. But I think that is something also, some lessons in how the things are working on that side. And again, I think that in terms of what we're going to go from now and what we're going to do and what is different from like 10 years ago, I think right now what I'm seeing, and again, this is my own perspective, I see the policy window for changing these things is much open. I see that a lot of donors right now, for example, in the discussions in IDA, in ADF, they're really trying to push for changes. The question is, again, whether those changes are the ones, that they are right or not. But I think that much more engages. I mean, and this kind of conversation is starting to open, which used to be very clustered. So I think one different thing, what I'm seeing, and with the opportunity for us is actually try to leverage on that opening. And again, I think there is an opportunity.
Thank you very much. Wade?
Thank you. I know we don't have much time left, and there were so many interesting questions. I'll touch on just 3 or 4 very briefly. Just from an aid agency's perspective on the grand challenges question, we definitely view it as a tool that's useful as we look to the future. And I think the grand challenges that we've conducted in the agency have brought real fresh thinking and new ideas into the agency that we wouldn't have had if it hadn't been for those grand challenges. I would say the challenge around grand challenges is when you identify a good idea, scaling it up. And we've had more difficulty. We've had more success, I would say, in identifying interesting new ideas than we have in taking them to scale. And I think that's probably what we need to work on in that area. I wanted to address the question, because I thought it was a great question about innovation and how do you generate will within your organization to innovate. And that's something that we have struggled with in USA, but I do think we've made some progress. I laugh to myself a little bit sometimes. Raj Shah, the previous administrator, when he first got to the agency, was trying to incentivize us to be more innovative and be more willing to look at failure. And he suggested early in his tenure that we should have a failure summit where everybody would come and talk about what they had failed at. And, we thought maybe that wouldn't be the best public relations move, but still he did introduce the idea into the agency that you are going to fail sometimes and you need to learn from the lessons. And another thing that he did that I think is important for the agency is he created this global development lab where we have gathered a group of people in the agency who are looking at innovation, whether it's from technology or new and innovative ways to program and contract and do that sort of thing. So that's been an explicit part. But I think to incentivize staff and let them know that it's okay, you have to be very explicit about it, and leadership has to talk about innovation. And then I wanted to just quickly address the question about the constraints that USAID faces, and we're not, obviously we're not an actor alone. We have the State Department, we have Congress, we have the rest of the interagency. But I may have misunderstood you, but I don't think it would be correct to say that we're not interested in data and evidence. The fact that we're not always able to act on them or that we have constraints, I don't think means that we're not interested in trying to do better and trying to use the lessons that we learned from the data and the evidence that we gather. And then the final thing I wanted to say is I get Bill's point about, we're given some discretion and latitude in Afghanistan, but the rules are the rules, and there are many laws and rules that the agency has to follow in Afghanistan and elsewhere. So I didn't want to leave you with the impression that it was kind of a free-for-all in Afghanistan and all the rules that apply.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Yeah, we have so many questions. You can always say, I pick a few that I really like to talk to. So I decided not to pick any of them. Maybe I touch upon a few of them that you have referred to, where just maybe making a few remarks that maybe I didn't make during my opening remarks. One is I think that our institution is set to really work at the country level. Our country engagement model is the way that we operate with our development work that we do. But I think recently we have really realized that many of the so-called global public bets or public goods, mostly they are bets, I think, really don't stop at the border. No? I mean, we had Ebola, we have the Zika virus at the moment, we have refugee crisis, we have climate change that also doesn't stop at the border. So I think really going forward, I think we have to realize that we have to develop some type of collaborative platforms by which actually we can provide financing and solutions to those countries that are going through some of these issues or these crises that they're gonna face. And there also you see that in a sense, you have to get out of your relative comfort zone. And for the bank, that means more collaboration with the United Nations. And we have seen, for example, the World Humanitarian Summit that took place in Istanbul. That really, that what you look at it, you see that the nexus between development and humanitarian development or assistance is really changing. When refugees live in a place for 17 to 11 or 11 to 17 years, I think it's 17 years if you take Afghanistan into account. If you take them out, you get to an average around 11%. If you take into account that 60% of refugees live actually in urban areas, you cannot argue anymore that this is not also a development problem. And that you need to help them with housing, that you need to help them with making sure that their kids go to school, that there's proper health facilities built or provided, and that people actually who are there, supposedly temporary, are actually also have access to jobs. Yeah, so I think going forward again, we will face a big challenge but also an opportunity for us to work together to solve some of these problems. Actually, I think the US government is making a big effort to have an event around UNGA in September to really talk about these issues in a wider perspective, and we welcome that very much. So the other thing is, of course, if you took just that fragility, because you brought up these issues about, okay, you're the solution bank, so what's the solution to doing domestic resource mobilization in fragile countries? I think another challenge and an opportunity that we actually face. Well, the easy answer would say, well, let's do more about prevention. Yeah, and I think actually prevention is very critical. And I think actually that the Sustainable Development Goals are probably maybe the best thing that we have now to actually try to work on prevention of issues around fragility, because it brings us also SDG 16, which is about peace, security. It allows us much more to bring these things up in our dialogue. We might have to work on different type of social contracts, which was not also an easy term. My boss will still not want me to use it, but it's something that you might have to discuss if you have issues with fragility. Also, why we now much more working on illicit flows, because these are things that provide incentives to take over governments or take over things. So there's a lot of prevention things going on. I think the other thing that we are facing in our institution, if we want to be more effective, is that we have to not do the easy projects anymore. Yeah? And it also has to do with leveraging. Why are we doing a bridge in Egypt? No. We can maybe help with the design, because that comes from the de-risking perspective. You can say, let us help with the preparation, let us help with the design, so that it has a stamp of approval from an international agency, say this is well prepared, this can be implemented, but then leave the financing to the private sector. And we should be much more engaged in the areas where the private sector doesn't want to go. I think if you look at the Sustainable Development Network, they had a particular group together to look at financing. They made what they call a sunset graph, by which they say, okay, if you're very low income, maybe ODA or international finance or institutions still need to do almost everything. But when you increase in income, they need to reduce themselves in infrastructure. So you need to be maybe less in financing issues of the private sector, like SMEs, but need to be more in the social sectors, where the private sector still finds it hard to go. And I think these things also need to come to institutions like ours. The incentives need to be provided by management, by our management, also by our shareholders. No? They also, in a sense, need to tell us, we do not want you to do these projects, because this is not where you really need it. You might be needed in the preparation, but you're not needed in the financing. And another thing, because we have done at one point, because we have hardly actually touched upon the wonderful papers that the two people have talked about. And I think what I always took with me, and this was a lecture to me by one of the people who sits here in the room. She's hiding somewhere in the back. She always told me, Jos, policies you set at the national level, but delivery of services takes place at the local level. And I think that also, is very important. So I really like the way that you guys have actually prepared these papers, the solutions that you're trying to bring to that, so that we better understand how actually we bring service delivery at the local level. Now, I also think, last point, that the MDGs really helped us with that. No, the MDGs really, because they were in service delivery on health, education, and water and sanitation. It really provided an opportunity for the NGOs and CSOs and the local level to come to these institutions like ours and to tell us, you need to change your delivery model that you are having.
Thank you very much. Done.
Thank you. So I think I'll also start from Peter's excellent and catalytic point, which is what happened in Paris, what's changed, why is anything of what we're saying different? And I think one thing Yuen and I share is what she described when she said, prescription is not, what was the line exactly? Prescription is not practice, right? So, the Paris Declaration is just that. It's a declaration. It's a cabinet statement, right? It does not get into the organizational weeds of how to actually change the system to address these things. And I think that is what we are proposing that at least I would submit might be somewhat novel in that regard. Let's think about how we actually drill down to the field, how we drill down to the agent on the ground, and think about what changes need to happen kind of up from the system to get at those emergent properties. There was some talk about data and good and bad data, and I couldn't be more on board that view. In fact, the sort of other half of the essay that I didn't really get into here is how output measurement and command and control systems create biases in how individuals behave and how organizations react, not just in adding inflexibilities, but also in actually distorting what agents are incentivized to do. And I think that when we think about how to use data, per Wade's, I think, excellent sort of description of the topography there, we need to think about what data we would want for what kind of answer and whether we, in fact, have information that can be useful in this case. There's a great IRC presentation that I recommend to everyone about what we knew about Ebola when, that ends up pointing out we knew lots of stuff about infection rates before, not immediately, but during the process of Ebola's sort of rollout. That was not at all used by actors on the ground, right? So there are cases where we don't use data that we should be using. There are cases where we're gathering the wrong data. And there are also cases where organizations are changing in a very smart and tactical way in response to evidence and data. And in this last category, I don't share what I take some of the cynicism from a few of the questions, skepticism, let's say, from some of the questions uttered here. That is, not only can organizations change, but they do have and are doing so now. Bill talked about the transformation of DFID in the 90s. I think USAID's push towards adaptive management, mentioned by Wade, is another excellent example here, as well as thinking about other ways to innovate. My suggestion is that we need to think about ways to innovate organizationally and in terms of what data we collect when and what those time horizons are, which feeds back into a topic I won't address in the interest of time, but this notion of risk appetite and the notion that risk minimization and results maximization will always and necessarily be in tension to each other. And time horizons and when we collect data on what kind of horizon, when we expect results, is a big part of squaring that circle. Finally, I would say that the USAID local systems framework, principle 1 of your framework, is recognize there is a system everywhere. And my closing point would be we should do just that with regards to our own organizations as we look in the mirror and think about the system that actually is delivering the assistance and how fundamental and systematic changes in it, driven initially by pilots and evidence, can change us for the 10-year horizon, for the 15-year horizon, and keep that change ongoing in this development project, which I suspect is not about to end anytime soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yuen.
Well, thank you very much for these very interesting questions. And in view of time, I can only respond to a few of them. I wanted to, first of all, to respond to someone's question about how this change to a localized approach is possible. Being an academic, I think I would like to believe that the necessary first step of change is planting new ideas, which is what we specialize in doing as academics. And I do believe that if we propose new ideas and we entertain new possibilities and we have conversations about them, that is an essential first step to making change. And I'm not saying that because I am an optimist. I say that because I'm a pragmatist, because cynicism has proven not to produce any results. So we might as well be optimistic and keep trying to reach for change. So I really do believe in ideas. The other point is that I don't just propose some new ideas. I do try, in connection with Dan's work as well, propose some concrete ideas for operational changes that can be made. And my suggestion, others would have better suggestions, is to create experimental pockets within 8 agencies. Because I'm just asking for the allocation of maybe 0.1% of the resources for this small pocket. An analogy is we might think about this as in militaries, they have standing armies, big standing armies that are relatively not mobile. But you always have a small special unit that can work with the bad guys, survive in jungles, do all the cool James Bond's tricks. And that's what I'm suggesting, that we just diversify the organizations and create different pockets of specializations and ideas and skills and goals. And the last question, someone asked about the mixture of strong and weak institutions. And the way we need to think about this is that we might broadly divide developing countries into authoritarian countries and democratic countries. So when we work with authoritarian countries, we might talk about development on the national scale. That is because authoritarian governments have much more leeway in just sort of changing policies at whim. So they can have huge successes and they can have huge failures, right? So we see that in China, we see that in East Asia. But when we look at other developing countries that are democratic, like India, and where the leaders and politicians are always constrained, what we find is that successes only emerge in pockets of the economy. So we find it in the film industry in Nigeria, in the pharmaceuticals industry in India, in the IT industry in Cambodia. So we really need to take developing countries and divide them by their political regime types and think about what is the best strategy to work with the governments and also to expect different outcomes because of these different regime types. So thank you again very much for this helpful conversation.
Thank you very much. I will not close this conversation. I think the hope is that the conversation will continue. And I must say that our theory of change is based on the idea that conversation is the start of any change. So, I mean, and I disagree with you, and I think cynicism is part of that conversation, and it brings back the questions to the table where we need to discuss them. So that's very fine. Let me make one comment on the Paris Declaration, because I do agree that there are some very valuable principles there. One of the problems is that the internal consistency of the principles taken together is rather weak. For example, there is a tension between results-based management and ownership, because when you manage for results, you don't tolerate failure, you want results. And that is incompatible with the idea of putting the beneficiary in the driving seat, which is what ownership is about. And that possible tension hasn't been dealt with. So the Paris Principle came without a doctrine of implementation. And that's why we are still with these principles that are always as valuable, but most of them hasn't been seriously implemented. We at GDN work on ownership. We build research capacity in developing countries to give them the means to enter that debate, to create, to shape the domestic political debate and policy debate, and that's the basis for democracy, much before being a project on research production. It's shaping human capital to create ownership. Let me end by introducing my two colleagues here, and if you want to know more about that Next Horizon essays and about GDN, you can interact with Alina Ziskovsky, who is GDN's representative in Washington, D.C., and Francesco Obino, who did a lot to organize these sessions based in Delhi. Let me thank the panel very much. Thanks both the Gates Foundation for having supported this initiative, CGD for hosting this panel, and of course Nancy for having played such a prominent role in chairing the jury and welcoming us today, and all of you for your patience, and all the panel members for a very interesting conversation. Thank you very much.